The funeral director froze mid-step, his polished shoes crunching on Montana gravel as 200 mourners turned toward the tree line. A massive male lion emerged from the pines, his golden mane catching the late afternoon sun as he padded silently toward the simple wooden casket of Robert "Bobby" Mitchell. This wasn't supposed to happen. Screams pierced the mountain air as elderly guests stumbled backward, folding chairs clattering to the ground. Children pressed against their parents' legs while grown men reached for cell phones with trembling fingers. Sarah Elizabeth Harper, 72 and draped in black silk, stood transfixed beside her caretaker's grave. She recognized those amber eyes, the same ones that had watched Bobby tend the sanctuary's wounded animals for 6 long years. The same lion who somehow knew Bobby was gone. "Nobody move!" Marcus Thompson shouted, his voice cracking with authority and terror. "Stay perfectly still." But Caesar the lion wasn't hunting. He was mourning. What had forged this impossible bond between a Vietnam veteran and an 800-pound predator? And why had Caesar traveled 15 miles from his enclosure to attend the funeral of the only man who'd ever shown him kindness? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary stretched across 2,000 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, where the Rocky Mountains kissed endless sky and ancient pines whispered secrets older than memory. Sarah Elizabeth Harper had built this haven with her late husband's oil fortune, transforming their ranch into a refuge for creatures the world had forgotten or abandoned. At 72, Sarah moved through her sprawling log mansion like a ghost haunting her own life. Each morning, she set the dining table for 2 out of decades-old habit, then quietly removed the second place setting. The silence echoed through rooms that once rang with laughter, where Christmas mornings had sparkled with promise and Sunday dinners had stretched long into evening. Now, only the grandfather clock's relentless ticking marked the passage of her solitary days. "Money can't buy happiness," she often whispered to her reflection, "but poverty can't buy anything either." Her husband William had left her everything: oil wells, stock portfolios, real estate worth $500 million, yet she'd trade every penny for one more conversation, one more shared cup of coffee on the wraparound porch. Down the winding gravel path, past the main house and visitor center, stood a weathered Airstream trailer that had seen better decades. This was home to Robert "Bobby" Mitchell, a man whose 67 years had been carved by war, loss, and an unshakable devotion to creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. His silver star and purple heart gathered dust in a shoebox beneath his narrow bed, overshadowed by photographs of rescued animals who'd found peace under his gentle care. Bobby's hands, scarred from shrapnel and softened by years of tending wounds, could calm a frightened deer or coax medicine down a sick coyote's throat. The sanctuary animals seemed to sense something in him, a kindness born from understanding what it meant to be broken and forgotten. Every morning at dawn, he made his rounds with pockets full of treats and a heart full of purpose, speaking to each creature as if they were old friends sharing secrets. Marcus Thompson, 45 and blessed with his mother's sharp intellect, managed the sanctuary's day-to-day operations from his office in the visitor center. Officially, he was Sarah's adopted son, taken in during his troubled teenage years when nobody else would have him. The story was simple, clean, believable, a wealthy widow opening her heart to a boy who needed direction. But truth, like Montana winters, had layers that ran deeper than anyone suspected. Then there was Victoria Sterling, Sarah's younger sister by 14 years, whose law practice in Billings had made her wealthy but never wealthy enough. At 58, Victoria wore designer suits like armor and calculated every conversation in billable hours. She visited Whispering Pines quarterly, her sharp eyes cataloging assets and liabilities with the precision of a hawk circling prey. "This place is bleeding money, Sarah," Victoria would say, her manicured fingers drumming against mahogany tables. "You're 72 years old playing house with wild animals. It's not sustainable." But sustainability meant something different when you measured it in second chances rather than quarterly profits. The October morning that changed everything began like any other, with Bobby's boots crunching through frost-kissed grass as he made his dawn rounds. The air carried that crisp bite that promised winter's approach, and his breath formed small clouds as he checked water troughs and scattered feed for the sanctuary's residents. At 67, these morning rituals had become as essential as breathing, a sacred routine that gave shape to days that might otherwise drift away like smoke. Bobby was refilling the water tank near the eastern fence line when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Not the usual morning chorus of awakening animals, but something else entirely. A low, guttural moan that spoke of agony beyond words. The kind of sound that had haunted his dreams since Vietnam, when wounded soldiers called out in languages pain made universal. Following the sound through a grove of aspens, their golden leaves trembling in the morning breeze, Bobby discovered the source of the anguish. There, caught in a steel-jawed trap hidden beneath fallen branches, was Caesar, the sanctuary's magnificent male lion, his amber eyes wide with pain and fury. The trap's serrated teeth had clamped down on his right front paw, and blood had already begun to pool in the dark earth beneath him. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to his belt. But as he moved closer, Caesar's lips pulled back in a snarl that could have awakened the dead. 800 pounds of trapped predator, wounded and terrified, separated from Bobby by maybe 15 feet of morning shadows. The old veteran had seen plenty of trapped animals in his years at the sanctuary, but never anything like this. The trap was commercial grade, the kind used by poachers who cared nothing for clean kills or quick deaths. Someone had deliberately placed it here, on sanctuary property, knowing full well what kind of damage it could inflict. Within 20 minutes, the entire sanctuary staff had assembled at a safe distance from the trapped lion. Sarah arrived in her Range Rover, her face pale beneath perfectly styled silver hair. Marcus followed close behind, his jaw set in the grim expression he wore when dealing with crises that threatened everything they'd built together. "We need to call Fish and Wildlife," Marcus said, already pulling out his phone. "They'll have the equipment to safely sedate him and remove the trap." But Victoria, who had arrived for one of her quarterly inspections, had different ideas. She stood apart from the group, her designer coat incongruous against the wild backdrop, calculating the situation with cold precision. "Don't be ridiculous," she interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making hard decisions. "Look at that animal. He's already lost significant blood, and that paw is mangled beyond repair. The humane thing is euthanasia." Sarah turned to stare at her sister, disbelief written across her weathered features. "Victoria, he's not dying. It's a paw injury. Animals recover from worse than this all the time." "Not 800-pound predators with damaged limbs," Victoria countered. "Do you have any idea what the liability insurance alone costs on an animal like that? Now add in veterinary bills, rehabilitation, the risk of infection, behavioral changes from trauma. Sarah, you're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars for an animal that will never be the same." The argument that followed would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. Victoria's voice grew sharper as she outlined the financial realities, the legal implications, the sheer impracticality of saving what she called a broken killing machine. Marcus found himself caught between the two sisters, understanding the business concerns while wrestling with the moral implications. But Bobby Mitchell, who had remained silent through the debate, finally spoke up. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah but keeping his eyes on Caesar, who had grown quieter as the humans argued around him. "I've seen a lot of broken things in my time. Some worth fixin', some not. But this one here, he's not given up. Look at his eyes." Everyone turned to follow Bobby's gaze. Despite the pain, despite the blood loss, Caesar's amber eyes burned with an unbroken spirit. He wasn't the defeated creature Victoria described. He was a fighter, waiting for his chance. "In Vietnam," Bobby continued, his voice steady despite the memories clawing at the edges of his consciousness, "we had a saying, leave no one behind. Didn't matter if they were hurt, didn't matter if it cost us everything. You don't abandon something just because it's broken." Sarah felt tears she hadn't shed in years threatening to spill over. "How much?" she asked Marcus, ignoring Victoria's sharp intake of breath. "How much will it cost to save him?" "Sarah, think about what you're doing," Victoria warned. "This is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that proves you're not competent to manage this kind of operation." But Sarah Elizabeth Harper had made her choice. The veterinary team from Billings arrived within 3 hours, their equipment truck kicking up clouds of dust as it wound through the sanctuary's gravel roads. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife specialist with 20 years of experience, took one look at Caesar and shook her head slowly. "This is going to be touch and go," she told Sarah and Bobby as her team prepared the tranquilizer equipment. "The trap's been on there for hours. We're looking at severe tissue damage, possible bone fractures, and definite nerve involvement. Even if we save the paw, he may never have full use of it again." Bobby knelt beside the supply cases, his weathered hands surprisingly steady as he helped organize medical supplies. "Doc, I've seen men come back from worse. Sometimes it's not about being perfect again. Sometimes it's just about getting another chance." The sedation process took 45 minutes of careful calculation and patient waiting. Caesar fought the drugs at first, his massive body tensing against the approaching unconsciousness, but eventually his amber eyes grew heavy and his breathing deepened into the rhythm of enforced sleep. What Dr. Walsh discovered when she finally pried open the trap made everyone present sick to their stomachs. The steel jaws had crushed through muscle and sinew, cracking the bones in Caesar's paw and severing several tendons. Worse yet, the trap was designed with serrated edges, a modification that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than efficient hunting. "This isn't a standard trap," Dr. Walsh observed grimly as she worked to clean the wounds. "Someone modified this specifically to cause maximum damage. This was meant to torture, not just capture." Victoria, who had been pacing the perimeter of the makeshift surgical area, finally exploded. "Do you see what I mean, Sarah? You're not just dealing with an accident here. Someone is actively targeting this place. What happens when they come back? What happens when they target you?" But Bobby's attention was fixed on something else entirely, something that would haunt him for months to come. As Dr. Walsh worked on Caesar's damaged paw, the old veteran noticed something carved into the trap's metal housing. Numbers. Not a serial number or manufacturer's mark, but something else. 12719668. "Doc," Bobby said quietly, pointing to the etching. "You see that?" Dr. Walsh paused in her work, following Bobby's gaze. Some kind of code. Bobby's face had gone pale. Those numbers weren't random. January 27, 1968. The date his unit had been ambushed outside Khe Sanh. The date Johnny Martinez had died in his arms, calling for his mother in Spanish, while Bobby pressed useless bandages against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Someone knows," Bobby whispered, his hands beginning to tremble for the first time all morning. Marcus noticed the change immediately. "Bobby." "What is it?" But before Bobby could answer, Dr. Walsh made a discovery that shifted everyone's attention back to Caesar. "This is interesting," she murmured, examining the lion's ear. This animal has been tagged before. See this small scar? That's from a tracking chip implantation. She ran a scanner over Caesar's neck and shoulder area until it beeped softly. There. He's got a chip, but it's not one of ours. The scanner's display showed a registration number that made Dr. Walsh frown. This chip is registered to Carver's Circus, but that operation shut down 15 years ago. A circus lion? Sarah asked, bewildered. But he's been wild since he was young. We rescued him from illegal exotic animal traders. Not according to this chip, Dr. Walsh replied. Carver's Circus went bankrupt in 2009. When it closed, dozens of animals were sold off to private collectors, roadside zoos, and yes, illegal wildlife traders. If Caesar came from there, it would explain some things. Marcus leaned forward, intrigued despite the crisis. What kind of things? Circus animals, especially those trained from cubs, develop different behavioral patterns than truly wild animals. They're more accustomed to human interaction, more likely to form individual bonds. It's not domestication exactly, but it's not pure wild instinct either. This revelation cast Caesar's behavior over the past 4 years in an entirely new light. His unusual tolerance for human presence, his apparent understanding of the sanctuary's routines, even his tendency to seek out Bobby specifically during feeding times, all of it suddenly made sense. As the surgical work continued, Bobby found himself studying Caesar's unconscious form with new eyes. The old circus performer, reduced to commodity and eventually abandoned to the black market. A creature trained to trust humans, only to be betrayed by them over and over again. The parallel to his own experience with the military, trained to trust the system, only to be discarded when his usefulness ended, wasn't lost on Bobby. "The surgery's going to take at least 3 more hours," Dr. Walsh announced, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I need to reconstruct several tendons and realign the bone fragments. Someone should call ahead to the recovery facility." "He's staying here," Sarah said firmly, ignoring Victoria's sharp look. "If he's going to recover, he's going to do it on familiar ground." Victoria pulled her sister aside, her voice low but urgent. "Sarah, listen to me. This isn't just about money anymore. Someone placed that trap specifically. Someone who knows enough about Bobby's military service to engrave his unit's worst day into the metal. This place isn't safe." But Sarah was looking at Bobby, watching the way his hands shook as he held a surgical instrument steady for Dr. Walsh. The old veteran was reliving something terrible. She could see it in his eyes. Whatever those numbers meant, they had opened a door he'd spent decades trying to keep closed. "We'll deal with security later," Sarah said quietly. "Right now, we save Caesar." As if sensing her words, the unconscious lion's breathing deepened, and one massive paw twitched slightly. Dr. Walsh smiled for the first time all day. "He's a fighter," she said. "With the right care and a little luck, he'll make it through this." But luck, as Bobby knew from hard experience, was often in short supply when old ghosts came calling. The weeks following Caesar's surgery passed in a haze of recovery routines and mounting tension that seemed to seep into every corner of Whispering Pines. Bobby had constructed a temporary recovery enclosure near his trailer, close enough that he could monitor Caesar's progress around the clock. The lion's damaged paw was healing, but slowly, and the psychological wounds ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. Caesar refused to eat for the first week, his amber eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the fence line, as if he were seeing ghosts that only he could perceive. Bobby understood that look. He'd worn it himself for years after coming home from Vietnam, when every shadow held the potential for ambush, and every unexpected sound sent his heart racing. "Back in my day," Bobby murmured to Caesar during one of their evening sessions, "we called it shell shock. Now they got fancy names for it, but it's all the same thing." "Takes time to trust again when the world's shown you its teeth." Gradually, Almost imperceptibly, Caesar began to respond to Bobby's presence. First, he would lift his head when the old veteran approached. Then, he started accepting small pieces of meat from Bobby's outstretched hand. By the third week, he was allowing Bobby to check his bandages without the low growl that had kept everyone else at a respectful distance. Dr. Walsh visited twice weekly, amazed by Caesar's progress and the unique bond developing between man and lion. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she confided to Sarah during one of her checkups. "It's almost as if they recognize something in each other." But while Caesar healed in body, Bobby's own health had taken a troubling turn. The stress of the rescue, combined with the haunting memories triggered by those numbers on the trap, had awakened old demons that decades of quiet routine had kept at bay. He'd started experiencing chest pains during his morning rounds, sharp spikes of pressure that left him breathless and reaching for the fence posts for support. Sarah noticed the changes first, the way Bobby's hand would drift unconsciously to his chest during conversations, how he'd pause longer between tasks, catching his breath in a way that seemed deliberate rather than natural. The careful way he lowered himself into chairs, as if sudden movements might trigger something painful. "Bobby," she said one morning, finding him sitting on the steps of his trailer with an untouched cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, "when's the last time you saw a doctor?" He looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much, lived through too much. "Doc's for folks who got somewhere to be tomorrow, Mrs. Harper." "I'm doing just fine right here, right now." That's not an answer, and we both know it. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, watching Caesar pace slowly around his enclosure, favoring his injured paw but moving with increasing confidence each day. "You know what the funny thing is about getting old? Every ache, every pain, every little thing that ain't working quite right, it all reminds you that you're temporary. Body's just a rental car and the lease is running out." Sarah settled beside him on the wooden steps, her silk blouse incongruous against the weathered wood but her presence solid and comforting. "My William used to say something similar. Life's not about how many days you get, Sarah. It's about what you do with the days you have." Sounds like a smart man. He was, sometimes too smart for his own good. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then continued, "He made me promise before he died that I wouldn't just exist after he was gone. That I'd keep living, keep finding purpose. Some days I think I've kept that promise. Other days—" Bobby understood. Purpose was a luxury that sometimes felt as distant as the mountains on the horizon. But watching Caesar slowly reclaim his strength, seeing the lion's trust rebuild day by day, gave shape to hours that might otherwise blur together in meaningless routine. Meanwhile, Victoria's visits had become more frequent and more pointed. She arrived the following Tuesday with a briefcase full of documents and a portable printer that she set up in Sarah's dining room like a field commander establishing headquarters. "I've been doing some research," Victoria announced, spreading financial reports across the mahogany table. "The sanctuary's operating expenses have increased 37% over the past 3 years. Veterinary costs alone are approaching 6 figures annually." Marcus, who had been trying to mediate between the sisters for weeks, studied the spreadsheets with growing concern. "The numbers are higher than I realized," he admitted. "But we've also taken in more animals. The cost per animal have actually decreased." "That's not the point," Victoria snapped. "The point is sustainability. Sarah, you're 72 years old. What happens when you can't manage this place anymore? What happens when you need long-term care? This sanctuary will drain every penny you have, and then what? You'll be dependent on charity, just like these animals." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied Victoria's visits. Her sister had always possessed the ability to find the weak spots in any argument, to press against the fears that kept people awake at 3 in the morning. I'm not planning to live forever, Victoria. But I'm not planning to die tomorrow either. Planning? Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Sarah, life doesn't care about your plans. Accidents happen. Health fails. Look at your precious caretaker. When's the last time he's been to a doctor? What happens when he collapses out there with one of your animals? What happens when someone gets killed? The argument that followed was the worst yet. Victoria's voice rose as she catalogued every possible disaster scenario, every financial liability, every legal vulnerability that the sanctuary represented. Sarah found herself defending not just the sanctuary, but the very idea that some things were worth more than their market value. Marcus tried to intervene, but the sisters were locked in a battle that had been brewing for decades. A fundamental disagreement about what constituted a life worth living. Victoria saw risk and irresponsibility where Sarah saw purpose and compassion. In the midst of their heated exchange, Bobby appeared at the kitchen door, his face pale and his hand pressed against his chest. "Mrs. Harper," he said quietly, "I think we might have a problem." All three of them turned toward him, the argument forgotten in the face of his obvious distress. But Bobby wasn't talking about his health. Through the kitchen window they could see Caesar pacing frantically in his enclosure, his head raised and his nostrils flaring as if he'd caught a scent that triggered every instinct for danger. "There's someone out there," Bobby said. "Caesar knows it, and so do the other animals. Everything's gone quiet except for him." The silence that followed was broken only by Caesar's low growl carrying across the sanctuary grounds. It was a sound that spoke of recognition, of threat, of a predator acknowledging the presence of something that didn't belong. Victoria looked out the window at the agitated lion and then back at her sister. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Sarah. You're living in the middle of nowhere with a house full of weapons that you can't control. What happens when someone with ill intentions shows up? What happens when those animals decide they don't want to be caged anymore?" But Sarah was watching Bobby, noting the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid, the way his left hand was clenched into a fist against his chest. The old veteran was experiencing more than just concern about intruders. He was reliving something. Some memory triggered by Caesar's alert posture and the sudden tension in the air. "Bobby," Sarah said gently, "why don't you sit down? Marcus can check the perimeter." But Bobby shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Caesar. "Ma'am, with respect, that lion saved my life once already. If he says there's danger out there, I believe him." The story came out in fragments over the next hour, as Marcus conducted a thorough search of the sanctuary grounds and found evidence of recent intrusion. Cut fence wire, fresh tire tracks in the soft soil near the eastern boundary, and most disturbing of all, another trap hidden near the main water source. This trap was different from the first one. Newer, more sophisticated, and equipped with a small camera that had been recording the sanctuary's activities for an unknown period of time. When Marcus brought the device to the house, Victoria's face went ashen. "Someone's been watching this place," she said, her earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. "This isn't random vandalism, Sarah. This is surveillance." Bobby examined the camera with hands that shook slightly, noting details that others might have missed. The mounting hardware was military grade. The camera itself was designed for long-term field operations. Most telling of all, the memory card contained footage spanning 3 weeks. Footage that included clear shots of Bobby's daily routines, Sarah's comings and goings, and detailed documentation of the sanctuary's security weaknesses. "Whoever set this up knows what they're doing," Bobby said quietly. "This isn't some local troublemaker. This is professional." As if to emphasize his point, Caesar's growling intensified, and several other animals began showing signs of agitation. The wolves started pacing their enclosure, the bears retreated to the far corners of their habitats, and even the usually placid deer gathered nervously in the center of their pasture. Sarah found herself caught between two kinds of fear. The immediate danger represented by whoever had been surveilling the sanctuary, and the longer-term threat to Bobby's health that was becoming impossible to ignore. The old veteran was sweating despite the cool October air, his breathing labored in a way that spoke of something more serious than stress. "We need to call the sheriff," Marcus said, but Bobby was already shaking his head. "Sheriff's a good man, but this is bigger than what he can handle. Whoever did this has resources, patience, and a specific agenda. They know about the Vietnam date on that first trap. They know about my routines. This isn't random." Victoria looked between Bobby and Sarah, her legal mind working through the implications. "You're talking about someone with a personal vendetta, someone who knows Bobby's history and is using it against him. The question is why?" The answer came to Bobby like a punch to the gut, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. The numbers on the trap, the professional-grade surveillance, the specific targeting of Caesar, the one animal at the sanctuary that had formed a bond with Bobby. "It's not about the sanctuary," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about me." The revelation that someone from Bobby's past was targeting him transformed the sanctuary from a place of healing into something that felt increasingly like a trap. Over the next 2 weeks, the evidence mounted in ways that made sleep impossible, and every shadow suspect. More cameras were discovered, hidden with military precision in locations that provided optimal surveillance of Bobby's daily routines. Someone had been studying him like a lab specimen, cataloging his movements with the patience of a predator. Dr. Walsh arrived for Caesar's scheduled checkup to find the lion in a state of heightened alertness that she'd never witnessed before. "His stress hormones are through the roof," she told Sarah after completing her examination. "Whatever's happening here, he senses it. Lions are apex predators. They don't get anxious unless there's a genuine threat." But the most disturbing discovery came when Marcus finally managed to extract data from the surveillance equipment. The footage didn't just show routine monitoring, it revealed something far more sinister: detailed documentation of Bobby's health episodes. The camera had captured him clutching his chest during morning rounds, recorded the exact timing of his medication schedule, and most chilling of all, showed someone approaching his trailer on 3 separate occasions when Bobby was away. "They've been inside," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger as he reviewed the footage. "Look at this timestamp, Tuesday morning when Bobby was at Caesar's enclosure. Someone spent 47 minutes in his trailer." Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis. The sanctuary had always been her refuge, the one place where she felt safe and purposeful. Now it felt violated, contaminated by the presence of someone who meant harm to the man who'd become like family to her. Bobby's reaction to the news was worse than anyone anticipated. The chest pains that had been occasional became constant, forcing him to pause every few steps during his rounds. His medication, a complex regimen of heart pills that he'd been taking for years, had been subtly tampered with. Not enough to kill him outright, but enough to weaken an already struggling cardiovascular system. "Someone's trying to make it look natural," Dr. Walsh explained after rushing to examine Bobby following a particularly severe episode. "If I hadn't run these blood tests, we might never have known. The dosages have been altered just enough to exacerbate his underlying condition." Victoria, for all her earlier complaints about the sanctuary's expenses, proved surprisingly fierce when it came to protecting her sister and the people Sarah cared about. She hired a private security firm within 24 hours, transforming Whispering Pines into something resembling a fortress. Motion sensors appeared along the perimeter, security cameras replaced the hidden surveillance equipment, and armed guards began patrolling the grounds in shifts. But Bobby chafed against the security measures like a caged animal. "This ain't living," he told Sarah as they watched uniformed guards march past his trailer. "This is existing behind bars, same as the animals we're supposed to be protecting." "It's temporary," Sarah insisted, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Just until we figure out who's behind this and why." The why became clearer when Bobby finally opened up about January 27, 1968, the date that had been carved into that first trap. The story came out in fragments, pulled from him like shrapnel from an old wound, each detail more painful than the last. "There were 12 of us on patrol that morning," Bobby said, his voice hollow as he stared out at Caesar's enclosure. "Route reconnaissance outside Quezon. We'd done it 100 times before, but this time was different. Someone had leaked our patrol route to the enemy." Sarah and Marcus listened in silence as Bobby described the ambush that had killed half his unit, including his best friend Johnny Martinez, a 19-year-old kid from El Paso who'd joined up to earn money for college and never made it home. But the worst part wasn't the firefight itself. It was what happened afterward. "The investigation concluded that someone in our unit had sold information to the enemy," Bobby continued, his hands trembling as he spoke. "They never proved who, but suspicion fell on our lieutenant, a guy named Thomas Carver, career military, family money, the kind of officer who looked good on paper but didn't give a damn about the men under his command." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Carver? As in Carver's Circus?" Bobby nodded grimly. "Same family?" "Thomas Carver came home from Vietnam with a dishonorable discharge and a trust fund. Used the money to buy exotic animals and start a traveling circus. Made millions exploiting creatures that couldn't fight back, just like he'd exploited his own men." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Carver's Circus, where Caesar had spent his early years, the professional-grade surveillance. The intimate knowledge of Bobby's military history and medical condition. Someone from the Carver family was settling old scores, using the sanctuary and its animals as weapons in a war that should have ended 50 years ago. "But Thomas Carver died 10 years ago," Marcus said, pulling up obituaries on his laptop. "Lung cancer. He had 2 sons, Michael and David. Michael runs a private military contracting firm in Virginia. David—" Marcus paused, his face going pale as he read further. "David Carver was convicted of animal cruelty in 2015. Multiple charges involving exotic animals. He was released from federal prison 6 months ago." The timeline fit perfectly. David Carver, bitter about his family's circus being shut down, blaming Bobby and others for the investigation that had led to his father's disgrace and eventual downfall. A man with resources, connections, and a decades-old grudge that had festered into something murderous. As if summoned by their conversation, Caesar began pacing frantically in his enclosure, his amber eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the eastern fence. The other animals followed suit, wolves howling, bears retreating to their dens, even the usually calm horses stamping nervously in their paddock. "He's here," Bobby said quietly, rising from his chair despite the obvious pain the movement caused him. "Caesar knows. Animals can sense things we miss." The security team went into high alert, but it was too late. David Carver had spent months learning the sanctuary's rhythms, studying its vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He hadn't come for a confrontation. He'd come to finish what he'd started with the poisoned medication and psychological warfare. The explosion came at sunset, just as the staff was settling into evening routines, not large enough to kill but precisely placed to cause maximum chaos and terror. The blast shattered the windows of the visitor center and sent animals into panic throughout the sanctuary. In the confusion that followed, with alarms blaring and security guards rushing toward the source of the explosion, no one noticed the figure moving through the shadows toward Caesar's enclosure. Except Caesar himself. The lion's roar split the Montana evening like a battle cry, alerting everyone within a mile that something was desperately wrong. By the time Bobby reached the enclosure, David Carver was already inside, a tranquilizer gun in his hands and murder in his eyes. 56 years, Carver said, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos around them. 56 years I've waited to watch you suffer the way my family suffered. My father died in disgrace because of your accusations. Our circus was destroyed. Everything we built, gone. Bobby stood at the enclosure gate, his hand pressed against his chest as his heart hammered against his ribs. Your father was a traitor who got good men killed. I don't regret exposing him. Good men? Carver laughed, a sound devoid of sanity. Like this animal? You've spent decades playing savior to broken creatures while my family lost everything. Time to see how it feels. Caesar stood between the two men, his massive body tense with the knowledge that violence was about to erupt. The lion's eyes moved between Bobby and Carver, calculating distances, assessing threats, preparing for battle. The beautiful thing is, Carver continued, raising the tranquilizer gun, it's going to look like an accident. Old veteran has heart attack in lion enclosure. Tragic, but not surprising given his condition, especially with his medication levels so carefully adjusted. But David Carver had made one fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed that Caesar was just another circus animal, broken and controllable like the creatures his family had once exploited. He hadn't counted on the bond that 8 months of gentle care had forged between man and lion. When Carver pulled the trigger, aiming the tranquilizer dart at Bobby's chest, Caesar moved with the lightning speed of a natural predator. 800 pounds of muscle and fury launched across the enclosure, intercepting the dart meant for Bobby and taking it in his own shoulder instead. The impact of Caesar's tackle sent Carver sprawling, the gun flying from his hands as he hit the ground hard. But the lion, already weakened by his earlier injuries and now fighting the effects of the tranquilizer, couldn't maintain his attack. He staggered, shook his massive head, and collapsed beside Bobby as the drugs took hold. Caesar! Bobby dropped to his knees beside the lion, his own heart crisis forgotten in the face of seeing his friend wounded again. The dart had delivered enough sedative to drop a healthy lion, and Caesar's breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. Security guards swarmed the enclosure, restraining Carver as he shouted incoherent threats about justice and revenge. But Bobby's attention was focused entirely on Caesar, whose amber eyes were growing dim as the tranquilizer overwhelmed his system. "Stay with me, big guy," Bobby whispered, his hand resting on Caesar's massive head. "You saved my life. Now let me save yours." The ambulance arrived within minutes, its red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the sanctuary as paramedics rushed toward Caesar's enclosure. Dr. Walsh had been called from her clinic 30 miles away, but Bobby knew that 30 miles might as well be 30,000 when measured against the erratic rhythm of Caesar's labored breathing. The tranquilizer dose was calculated for a human, one of the paramedics explained to Sarah as they worked frantically to stabilize both Bobby and Caesar. For a lion that's already been through trauma and surgery, this amount could be fatal. Bobby refused treatment until he was certain Caesar would receive care. Despite the crushing pain in his chest and the way his left arm had gone numb, he knelt beside the unconscious lion, his weathered hand resting on Caesar's flank to monitor each shallow breath. "Sir, you need to come with us right now," the lead paramedic insisted. "You're showing signs of cardiac distress." "We need to get you to the hospital immediately." "I'm not leaving him," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying the same stubborn authority that had once kept his Vietnam unit together through impossible odds. "Caesar took that dart meant for me. I'm not abandoning him now." Sarah found herself caught between two medical crises, watching the two beings she'd grown to love most slowly slipping away in front of her. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of loneliness, She'd finally found a family of sorts, only to face losing them both on the same terrible night. Dr. Walsh arrived just as Caesar's breathing became critically shallow. She took one look at the lion's condition and began barking orders to her assistant, transforming the enclosure into an emergency operating room lit by floodlights and powered by portable generators. "We need to counteract the tranquilizer and support his respiratory function," she said, working with the focused intensity of someone who knew that minutes mattered. The dose was nearly 3 times what would be safe for an animal his size, especially given his previous trauma. While Dr. Walsh fought to save Caesar, the paramedics continued their battle for Bobby's life. The stress of the evening's events had triggered a massive heart attack, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly despite their interventions. "Bobby," Sarah said, kneeling beside him as the paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital. "You have to go with them. Caesar wouldn't want you to die because of him." Bobby's eyes, clouded with pain but still sharp with determination, found hers. "Mrs. Harper, that lion and I, we understand each other. We're both broken things that somebody cared enough to fix. If he doesn't make it—" His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Marcus appeared at Sarah's shoulder, his face grim with the weight of responsibility. "The police have Carver in custody, but we need to get Bobby to the hospital. The sanctuary can wait. Family comes first." The word family hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that none of them had fully acknowledged until this moment. Bobby Mitchell wasn't just an employee or even a friend. He'd become the father figure Sarah had never had, the steady presence that had given shape and purpose to her later years. "Go," Dr. Walsh called out without looking up from her work on Caesar. "I'll stay with him through the night. If there's any change at all, I'll call you immediately." The ride to Billings General Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical equipment, with Bobby drifting in and out of consciousness while paramedics worked to keep his damaged heart beating. Sarah rode in her Range Rover behind the ambulance, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. At the hospital, the emergency room team took over with the efficient choreography of people who dealt with life-and-death crises every day. Bobby disappeared behind swinging doors, leaving Sarah alone in a waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Victoria arrived within an hour, having driven from Billings as soon as she received Sarah's frantic phone call. For once, the sisters' differences seemed insignificant in the face of genuine crisis. "How is he?" Victoria asked, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs beside Sarah. "They won't tell me anything," Sarah replied, her voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. "I'm not family, not officially. 50 years of marriage, and I never learned how alone you can feel in a hospital waiting room when you're not blood-related to the person fighting for their life." The wait stretched through the night, punctuated by brief updates from nurses who spoke in the carefully neutral tones of medical professionals trained to reveal nothing. Bobby was in surgery. The surgery was complex. The doctors were doing everything possible. At 3 a.m, Dr. Walsh called with news about Caesar. The lion had stabilized, but barely. His liver was struggling to process the massive dose of tranquilizer, and his previous injuries had been aggravated by the stress of the attack. "He's not out of the woods," Dr. Walsh said carefully. "The next 24 hours will be critical. But there's something else, Sarah. Something remarkable. When I was examining him, I found something tucked into his mane. A small piece of fabric. It's from Bobby's work shirt. Caesar must have grabbed it during the struggle." Sarah felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. Even unconscious, even fighting for his life, Caesar had held on to a piece of the man who'd shown him kindness. Dawn was breaking over the Montana mountains when Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the cardiac surgeon, finally emerged from the operating room. Her scrubs were stained with sweat and blood, and her expression carried the weight of someone who'd just spent 8 hours battling death. "Mrs. Harper?" Dr. Chen approached Sarah with the careful steps of someone delivering news that could change everything. "You're listed as Mr. Mitchell's emergency contact." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "The surgery went well, considering the extent of the damage. We were able to place 3 stents and restore blood flow to the affected areas of his heart. But I have to be honest with you. Mr. Mitchell's heart has been compromised for years. The stress he's been under, combined with what appears to be medication tampering, created a perfect storm." "Will he live?" Sarah asked, the question she'd been afraid to voice finally escaping. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "The next 72 hours will be critical. His heart is functioning, but it's been severely weakened. Recovery at his age with his medical history will be challenging. There's also the question of lifestyle changes. If he survives this, he'll need to significantly reduce physical stress and activity." The implication was clear. Bobby's days of caring for the sanctuary animals, the work that had given his life meaning and purpose, were likely over. Sarah spent the rest of the morning sitting beside Bobby's hospital bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest as machines monitored every heartbeat. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the tubes and wires that kept him tethered to life. Marcus arrived with coffee and devastating news. David Carver had been charged with attempted murder, assault, and domestic terrorism, but his lawyer was already building a defense based on temporary insanity and PTSD from his father's military disgrace. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "The police found evidence that Carver had been planning this for months. He'd researched Bobby's medical history, studied the sanctuary's routines, even practiced with tranquilizer guns. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated revenge." As if summoned by their conversation about justice and consequences, Bobby's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused at first, but gradually sharpened as he recognized Sarah's face beside his bed. "Caesar?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried all the weight of Bobby's concern. "He's alive," Sarah said quickly, taking Bobby's hand in both of hers. "Dr. Walsh is with him. He's fighting, just like you." Bobby's eyes closed again, but Sarah could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. Even on what might be his deathbed, his first thought had been for the lion who'd saved his life. Outside the hospital window, the Montana sun climbed higher into a sky that promised another beautiful day. But Sarah knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The sanctuary, Bobby's health, her own sense of security, all of it had been forever changed by one man's decades-old thirst for revenge. The only question now was whether love and loyalty would prove stronger than hatred and bitterness. Bobby Mitchell died on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after his heart surgery, while Sarah held his hand and Caesar lay recovering 50 miles away at the sanctuary. It wasn't the dramatic, painful death that anyone had feared during those first critical hours. Instead, it was quietly devastating, a gentle slipping away that came without warning, like a candle flame guttering out in a room grown suddenly still. Sarah had spent the night at the hospital, as she had every night since Bobby's surgery. She'd been reading aloud from an old Louis L'Amour Western, one of Bobby's favorites, when she noticed that his breathing had changed. Not labored or distressed, but simply lighter, as if he were letting go of something heavy he'd been carrying for too long. "Bobby?" she whispered, setting the book aside and leaning closer to his bed. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful in a way she'd rarely seen during his waking hours. The ever-present lines of worry and old pain had smoothed away, leaving behind the ghost of the young soldier he'd once been. Dr. Chen later said that Bobby's heart had simply given out, weakened beyond its ability to sustain life despite the surgery's technical success. But Sarah knew better. Bobby had waited until he was certain Caesar would survive, until the lion was out of immediate danger and beginning the slow process of recovery. Only then had he allowed himself to rest. The news reached the sanctuary within an hour, carried by Marcus in a phone call that shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. Dr. Walsh, who had been monitoring Caesar's recovery around the clock, later said that the lion's behavior changed the moment Bobby died, even though no one had told him. Caesar stopped eating again, retreated to the far corner of his enclosure, and began the low, mournful vocalizations that wildlife experts call grief calls. "It's impossible, Doctor," Walsh said, but her scientific skepticism couldn't explain what everyone at the sanctuary witnessed. There's no way Caesar could know what happened 50 miles away, yet his behavior suggests he does. Sarah found herself caught between her own grief and the practical demands of arranging a funeral for a man who'd lived simply but touched countless lives. Bobby had left specific instructions in a handwritten will tucked away in his trailer. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. He wanted to be buried at the sanctuary, beneath the oak tree where he'd sat so many evenings watching the animals settle in for the night. The revelation of Bobby's will brought the first major shock. Hidden beneath the humble exterior of a man who'd lived in a trailer and worn the same work clothes for years was a carefully managed fortune. Bobby Mitchell, it turned out, had inherited substantial oil rights from his family's Oklahoma land, investments that he'd never touched except to quietly fund various veterans organizations and animal rescue groups. But the real surprise was what he'd left to Sarah and the sanctuary: $2 million, with specific instructions that the money be used to ensure that no animal at Whispering Pines would ever be euthanized for financial reasons. He'd also left detailed notes about each animal's care preferences, behavioral quirks, and medical histories, a lifetime of observation distilled into careful handwriting that spoke of deep love and attention. "He never said a word," Sarah murmured as she and Marcus read through Bobby's meticulous records. "All these years he could have lived anywhere, done anything. But he chose to stay here, chose to live simply so he could give everything to the animals." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying a photograph Bobby had included with his notes. A picture of himself and Caesar taken just weeks after the lion's rescue surgery. In the photo, Bobby was kneeling beside Caesar's recovery enclosure, his weathered hand extended through the fence while Caesar gently nuzzled his palm. "There's something else," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah look up from Bobby's papers. "Something I should have told you years ago. Something about why I really came to work here." Sarah felt the world shift slightly, the way it does when you realize that solid ground isn't as solid as you thought. "What do you mean?" Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph, a picture of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a baby. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photograph was herself, 47 years younger, cradling an infant she'd held for only 3 days before her father forced her to give him away. "My adoptive parents named me Marcus Thompson," he said quietly, "but I was born Michael William Harper. I'm your son, Sarah. I've been your son all along." The silence that followed was profound, filled with 20 years of careful pretense suddenly stripped away. Sarah stared at the photograph, then at Marcus, seeing for the first time the unmistakable resemblance she'd somehow missed. The shape of his eyes, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the gentle way he handled the animals. "You knew?" she whispered. "All this time, you knew who I was?" Marcus nodded, tears running down his cheeks. "I found you when I was 18. Hired a private investigator, spent months tracking down the records. When I learned about the sanctuary, about the work you were doing, I knew I wanted to be part of it. But I was afraid you might reject me again, afraid you might not want the reminder of what you'd been forced to give up. Forced to give up, Sarah repeated, the words heavy with decades of regret. Marcus, Michael, I never wanted to let you go. My father said it would ruin the family reputation, said no one would ever marry me if they knew. I was 19 and scared, and I thought I had no choice. I know, Marcus said simply. I've known for years, and I've watched you build this sanctuary into something beautiful. Watched you pour all the love you couldn't give me into these animals. Bobby figured it out, you know. About 2 years ago, he cornered me one day and said, "Son, that woman's been carrying a broken heart for 20 years, thinking about a baby she lost. You planning to tell her the truth before one of you dies?" The revelation reframed everything. Marcus's intuitive understanding of Sarah's moods, his protective instincts, the way he'd seemed to know exactly what the sanctuary needed even before Sarah realized it herself. All those years, he'd been watching over her from a distance, as careful and devoted as Bobby had been with the wounded animals. He made me promise, Marcus continued, that if anything happened to him, I'd tell you the truth. He said families shouldn't have secrets, especially not families that have already lost too much time. Sarah reached across the table and took her son's hands in hers, feeling for the first time the connection she'd yearned for since the day she'd been forced to let him go. "Michael," she said, testing the name she'd never been allowed to speak aloud. "My Michael." The funeral was planned for the following Saturday, a small service that would be held in the sanctuary's main clearing just as Bobby had requested. Word spread through networks of animal lovers, veterans organizations, and the tight-knit community of people who'd known Bobby during his decades of quiet service. What was expected to be a gathering of perhaps 20 people grew into something much larger. By Friday afternoon, the sanctuary's parking area was filled with cars from across the region. Veterans who'd served with Bobby in later years, veterinarians who'd worked with him on difficult cases, and dozens of people who'd simply been touched by his kindness over the years. Sarah found herself playing hostess to a wake that had turned into a celebration of a life more widely appreciated than anyone had realized. Victoria arrived Friday evening, her usual sharp business attire replaced by simple black clothes and an expression of genuine sorrow. "I never knew," she said simply as she embraced Sarah. "I never knew how much good he did, how many lives he touched. I'm sorry for the things I said about him being a burden." Dr. Walsh reported that Caesar's health was improving daily, but the lion remained withdrawn and uninterested in his usual activities. "Grief is real for animals," she explained to the gathered mourners. "Elephants visit the bones of their dead for years. Wolves howl for lost pack members. Caesar's response is completely natural." As Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the first snow of winter dusting the Montana peaks, Sarah stood in her bedroom looking out at the gathering crowd. People were arriving in groups, some carrying flowers, others bringing photographs and mementos of their interactions with Bobby over the years. But what captured Sarah's attention was movement near Caesar's enclosure. The lion was pacing with unusual energy, his head raised and alert in a way Dr. Walsh hadn't seen since before Bobby's death. Something had changed overnight, some shift in Caesar's awareness that suggested he understood on some level what was about to happen. "He knows," Sarah whispered to herself, watching Caesar pace the fence line closest to where Bobby's grave had been prepared. "Somehow, he knows we're saying goodbye today." As the mourners gathered in the clearing beneath the ancient oak tree, Caesar's calls began. Not the mournful grief sounds of the past weeks, but something different, something that sounded almost like summoning. The funeral that followed would be remembered by everyone present as extraordinary. but for reasons that had nothing to do with the eulogy or the prayers or the military honors that honored Bobby's service. It would be remembered because of what happened when Caesar appeared at the tree line, having somehow escaped his supposedly secure enclosure and walked slowly toward the gathering of humans who'd come to honor his friend. The funeral that Saturday afternoon began with the crisp formality of military tradition, but it ended with something that no one present would ever forget, a testament to bonds that transcend species and love that endures beyond death. 200 people had gathered beneath the oak tree where Bobby had requested to be buried, their breath forming small clouds in the November air as Pastor Williams from the local Methodist church delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of a man who'd lived quietly but loved deeply. Veterans in dress uniforms stood at attention beside wildlife conservationists in practical boots, united in their respect for someone who'd dedicated his life to healing the broken and protecting the vulnerable. Sarah sat in the front row, still processing the revelation that Marcus, her Michael, was beside her, no longer hiding behind the careful distance of an employee, but embracing his role as her son. The secret that had shaped both their lives for 20 years had finally been laid to rest, along with Bobby's other carefully guarded truths. As Pastor Williams spoke about Bobby's service in Vietnam and his decades of caring for wounded animals, Sarah found her attention drawn to Caesar's enclosure in the distance. The lion had been pacing frantically all morning, his agitation growing more pronounced as the funeral preparations intensified. Dr. Walsh had assured everyone that the enclosure was secure, that there was no way Caesar could escape. But something about his behavior made Sarah uneasy. The formal ceremony concluded with the playing of taps by a bugler from the local VFW post, the mournful notes echoing across the sanctuary as Bobby's simple pine casket was lowered into the earth he'd loved. Sarah stepped forward to throw the first handful of soil onto the wooden surface, her tears falling freely for the first time since Bobby's death. It was then, in the moment of deepest grief and reverence, that Caesar appeared. The lion emerged from the tree line 50 yards away, moving with the silent grace of a natural predator, but showing none of the aggression that should have accompanied a wild animal approaching a large group of humans. His golden coat gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the scar on his right front paw, still visible from his encounter with the poacher's trap, seemed to catch the light like a badge of honor. The reaction was immediate and instinctive. Screams pierced the cold air as people scrambled backward, some running toward the parking area while others froze in place, paralyzed by the primal fear of facing an apex predator. Veterans who'd faced enemy fire found themselves reaching for weapons they weren't carrying, while elderly mourners clutched each other in terror. "Nobody move!" Dr. Walsh shouted, her voice cutting through the panic with professional authority. Sudden movements will trigger his predator instincts. Stay calm and back away slowly. But Caesar wasn't behaving like a predator seeking prey. His amber eyes were fixed on the gravesite, and his massive head was lowered in what could only be described as a posture of respect. He moved through the scattered crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, people instinctively moving aside to create a path that led directly to Bobby's final resting place. Sarah, despite every instinct screaming at her to run, found herself rooted in place beside the grave. Something in Caesar's demeanor, in the deliberate way he approached, told her that this wasn't an attack. This was something else entirely. Something that defied explanation but demanded witness. Caesar stopped at the edge of the grave, barely 3 feet from where Sarah stood. For a long moment he simply stared down at the pine casket, his breathing visible in the cold air. Then, in a gesture that brought gasps from the watching crowd, he lowered his massive head and placed something on the freshly turned earth. It was a piece of fabric, torn from Bobby's work shirt. The same shirt he'd been wearing the day Caesar saved his life. The lion had carried it in his mouth from his enclosure to the gravesite, a final offering to the man who'd shown him kindness when the world had been cruel. Marcus was the first to understand what was happening. "He's not here to hurt anyone," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "He's here to say goodbye." What followed challenged everything the mourners thought they knew about wild animals and the boundaries between species. Caesar settled beside the grave in a posture unmistakably similar to the way a dog might lie down beside his master's bedside. His great head rested on his paws, and he began to emit a low, rumbling vocalization that wildlife experts would later describe as unlike anything in the recorded literature of lion behavior. Dr. Walsh, who had edged closer with the caution of someone trained to read animal behavior, found herself witnessing something that her scientific education couldn't explain. "That's not a growl or a roar," she whispered to Sarah. "It's almost like he's mourning, like he's singing a funeral song." The sound continued for several minutes, rising and falling like a lament that seemed to capture all the grief and love that couldn't be expressed in words. Other animals throughout the sanctuary began responding. Wolves howling in the distance, bears emerging from their dens to stand alert at the edges of their enclosures, even the birds falling silent as if acknowledging something sacred was taking place. As Caesar's song ended, he stood and approached Sarah directly. Every person present held their breath, watching as 800 pounds of predator moved to within arm's reach of a 72-year-old woman who should have run for her life. Instead, Sarah found herself looking into Caesar's amber eyes and seeing not a wild animal, but a fellow mourner who understood loss in ways that transcended species. Caesar gently touched his massive head to Sarah's outstretched hand, a gesture so tender and deliberate that it brought tears to the eyes of hardened veterans and skeptical scientists alike. In that moment, the barriers between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, seemed to dissolve entirely. Pastor Williams, who had been frozen in amazement like everyone else, found his voice. "I've been conducting funerals for 40 years, he said softly, "and I've never seen anything that spoke more clearly to the presence of divine love in all creation." After several more minutes, Caesar turned and walked slowly back toward the tree line, pausing once to look back at the gravesite before disappearing into the forest that bordered the sanctuary. He'd come to pay his respects, to honor the memory of someone who'd treated him with dignity and kindness, and to demonstrate that loyalty and love exist in forms that human understanding has barely begun to recognize. The mourners who remained, and remarkably, most of them did remain, finished the burial service in a state of awed reverence that transformed a simple funeral into something approaching the miraculous. As they filed past Bobby's grave to pay their final respects, many left not just flowers and mementos, but small pieces of their own understanding about what it means to love unconditionally. Sarah was the last to leave, standing beside the grave as the sun set behind the Montana peaks and painted the sky in shades of gold and purple that seemed appropriate for saying goodbye to a man who'd lived his life in service to others. "Thank you," she whispered, speaking to Bobby's memory, to Caesar wherever he'd gone, and to the universe that had somehow orchestrated this impossible demonstration of love transcending death. Sometimes the most profound truths come wrapped in the simplest moments: a loyal friend who never gives up, a family secret revealed too late, or an animal who understands grief better than most humans. Bobby Mitchell's story reminds us that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch and the love we give freely. His quiet devotion to Caesar and the sanctuary animals, combined with Sarah's journey from loneliness to rediscovered family, shows us that it's never too late to find your tribe, heal old wounds, or discover that the family you've been searching for has been right beside you all along. Caesar's tribute at Bobby's funeral proves that loyalty transcends species and that the bonds we forge through kindness echo far beyond our earthly time. In a world that often feels disconnected and harsh, this story offers hope that love, whether between humans or across species, remains the most powerful force for healing. True happiness isn't about having everything perfect. It's about recognizing the extraordinary within the ordinary, cherishing the connections that matter, and never underestimating the profound impact of simply showing up for those who need us most. What moment in your life taught you the true meaning of loyalty? Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that changed your perspective on family or friendship? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.